Hello and welcome back. In the first session, I explained how Confucianism became the dominant worldview during the Joseon dynasty, and I presented an example of how this was manifested. In the second session, I explained how the adherence to Confucian worldview shaped the ways in which Joseon people dressed and the objects they used. The third session focused on the paintings and manuscripts that were produced in the Joseon period to record Confucian state rituals. In today's session, we will explore in more detail decorative forms of art that were made during the Joseon dynasty. In particular, we will focus on the manufacture and use of ceramics, as their production and use offer crucial insights into life and cultural traditions of the Joseon dynasty. In particular, white porcelain vessels are seen as characteristic artifacts of this period, markedly different from the elegantly potted and delicately inlaid celadon ceramics of the previous kingdom of Goryeo. Porcelains were made to cater for the new Confucian Yangban elite, who ruled the country and dominated all spheres of life. During the Joseon kingdom, two main types of ceramic ware were produced: buncheong and porcelain. The former were made only until the early 16th century, while the latter were manufactured till the end of Joseon. The term buncheong derives from bunjang, haejang, sagi, that was coined by the Korean art historian Ko Yu-seop in the early 20th century. It refers to the clay type and appearance of buncheong, namely a stoneware covered with white slip and a glaze of grey-green colour. They began to be made in the late 14th century, often in the kilns that had previously produced celadon ceramics. This shallow bowl from the collection of the National Museum of Korea is a representative example of a buncheong ceramic ware. It is of a light brown colour and is thickly potted. The exterior and interior walls of the bowl have been decorated with a range of stylized patterns arranged in concentric registers. The densely set chrysanthemum design is a typical feature of buncheong ceramics and was achieved by densely stamping the design into the wet clay, whereafter the indented motif was filled with white slip. Slip is clay thinned with water. Thereafter, the vessel was glazed and fired. In the center of the vessel, you can see 3 Chinese characters surrounded by chrysanthemum designs. They read Jiang Hongguo, which was a government office responsible for supplying items used within the royal palace. The inscription suggests that it was made for a provincial government for the purpose of being presented to the central government in Seoul. The inscription reflects that the production of buncheong ceramics was managed by the government. Saongbang, the government office in charge of preparing the king's meals and the royal banquets, sent officials to regional kilns to supervise the production of ceramics. According to the royal records, there were 324 kilns in the Korean peninsula in the 15th century, most of them located in the central and southern parts of the country. The widespread popularity of buncheong wares is reflected in the large number of kilns recorded. 185 kilns made buncheong stonewares, in contrast to 139 kilns that made porcelain wares. The manufacture of buncheong changed drastically in the 1460s when official court kilns were established to make porcelains for the royal court and government bureaus. It was during this time that the Joseon government decreed that only porcelain used at the court for eating and when performing rituals should be used. This move followed institutional practices of Ming China, where porcelains had been designated imperial wares. The impact on buncheong production was significant, as reflected in the iconography, quality, as well as consumption of the wares. Having lost their elite mandate, some kilns shut down, while others turned to manufacturing wares for local and regional consumers. In the 16th century, The production of buncheong suffered further when the Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi invaded the Korean peninsula twice in 1592 and 1597. Referred to as the Imjin Wars in Korean sources, they caused huge devastation in Chosun due to the human losses as well as economic and infrastructure damage. The Japanese army also captured a large number of potters who were forcibly taken to Japan, where they were established in kilns under the domain of local daimyo. Daimyo's interest in tea wares made them value Korean buncheong ceramics highly, hence their desire to have Korean buncheong potters make vessels for them in Japan. Porcelains had been produced on the peninsula since the Goryeo Kingdom. However, it was not until the Chosun Kingdom that they began to be made in large quantities. Their rise to popularity was caused by internal and external factors. The Neo-Confucian elite of Chosun heavily criticized the frivolous and extravagant fashions of the Goryeo dynasty and instead advocated austerity and economic restraint at the royal court and in aristocratic homes. Huge numbers of specially made objects were needed for ritual use, and they signified the authority and legitimacy of the ruling court. Initially, ritual wares were made of brass, as this material was deemed to best convey notions of tradition and decorum. Many of them took their shapes after ancient Chinese bronzes, among them the bo, which was a container for rice and sorghum that was placed in the center of the ritual table. Its square body and domed lid symbolized the ancient belief that heaven is square and earth is round. However, difficulties in securing enough metal eventually led to a shift towards ceramic vessels, typically white porcelains. It resulted in an annual consumption of porcelains that exceeded 13,000 pieces, and this number increased when state funerals and weddings were held. The porcelains were manufactured in the official kilns managed by the Office of the Royal Kitchen, which was not only responsible for catering to the king's culinary needs, but also in charge of supplying vessels used at court functions. The kilns were located in Gwangju County and eventually became known as Bunwon, meaning branch office of the Sound One. Many different types of ritual porcelain vessels were placed on offering tables and used in ancestor worship ceremonies, including those held at the Royal Ancestral Shrine in Seoul. Some were inscribed with the Chinese character jie, meaning offering. This porcelain vessel is a representative example of that. The center of the dish carries the Chinese character for ritual, pronounced jie in Korean, painted with cobalt blue pigment. Also, the shape of the dish is indicative of its ritual use. The elevated height of the vessel and its flat surface was well suited for food offerings. Pure white porcelains without any decoration make up the largest quantity of porcelains manufactured during the Chosun Kingdom. Not only did they fit Confucian sentiments well, with their plain appearance, they were also well suited for ritual use. However, from the beginning of the Chosun dynasty, cobalt blue decorated porcelain vessels became extremely popular. The desire for them among the Yangban and the ruling elite may in part be because the pigment enabled the addition of painterly scenes, inscriptions, as in the case of the ritual dish I showed you earlier, and other patterns that in various ways enhance the visual qualities of the vessels. Yet cobalt blue decorated porcelain vessels were extremely expensive to produce. Good quality cobalt had to be imported from China, and it was said to have been as expensive as gold. Many porcelain vessels were made for scholarly pursuits, reflecting the emphasis placed on education and studying in the Chosun dynasty. Because state examinations were the primary means by which Yangban could obtain government posts, studying and learning took on great significance in Chosun. Yet, education extended beyond personal gain, in that high-ranking Yangban scholar officials were entrusted with the task of educating the king, whose superior moral and enlightened stature was considered crucial to the stability and success of his rule. In this way, the Yangban's pursuit of knowledge and their advocacy of a Confucian lifestyle served to promote Confucian values among all social strata. Dubbed the Four Friends of the Study, objects made for the scholar's study were paper, brushes, ink sticks, and inkstones. Other items which were produced in large numbers for Yangban consumption were holders for paper and brushes. The object you see here is a container for the many brushes that were used for writing and painting. Other popular items were so-called water droppers, an example of which you see here. When writing, scholars would dip a brush in black ink. The ink was made by mixing solid ink with water and grinding it against a hard surface, called an inkstone. The water had to be added carefully, drop by drop. If too much water was mixed with the solid ink, the ink would turn too watery and the color would be light gray. Conversely, if too little water was added to the inkstone, the ink would be too thick, making it impossible to write with. Therefore, scholars needed a small-sized container for water, giving rise to the water dropper. In the Joseon period, many different kinds of water droppers were made. Many carry shapes and motifs befitting a scholarly literati, such as bamboo, which was a symbol of uprightness, or peaches, which were symbols of longevity. Also popular were carp, which were symbols of persistence and passing of state examinations. Most of such water droppers were made of porcelain. Many are plain white or painted sparingly with cobalt blue pigment in accordance with Confucian notions of frugality. However, this peach-shaped water dropper was decorated with cobalt blue and copper red pigments, making it very colorful. During the late 18th and 19th century, the rigid class system that had defined Joseon society began to break down, as reflected in the rise of commoner landowners. Upward social mobility also led to an increase in the number of people using porcelains, and the new consumers stimulated the output of new and varied shapes and designs. This new group of scholars did not belong to the Yangban class, but were of the lower-ranking Jungin class, meaning middle people. They were a relatively small hereditary class of bureaucrats and artisans who served the court and the Yangban as clerks, interpreters, and accountants, among other professions. Though they copied the Yangban in their pursuit of scholarly activities, their taste in art was less conservative. They did not confine themselves to the restrained mood that typified Yangban aesthetics, but embraced more colorful and playful art forms. By this time, the Bunwon kilns no longer made wares exclusively for court use, but also catered to the increasingly lucrative private market made up of Yangban as well as lower-class patrons. To satisfy their taste, Bunwon potters began producing wares that broke with past traditions in favor of new and modern styles. The colorful and informal appearance of this peach-shaped water dropper suggests that it may have been made for a scholar of the Jungin class towards the end of the Joseon dynasty. This session has explored the decorative arts of the Joseon dynasty in greater depth, with a special emphasis on ceramics. During the Joseon dynasty, two types of vessels formed the mainstay of ceramic production, namely buncheong and porcelain. Both types were made for the secular and ritual uses, and their production was overseen by the central government. Drawing on a few examples, the lecture highlighted how such ceramics were designed to serve the new Confucian Yangban elite who dominated and influenced every aspect of life during the Joseon dynasty. In the next session, we will look into how production of art changed in the late 19th century as a result of the many rapid changes that took place on the Korean peninsula during this time.